The Nazis and communists are generally viewed as polar opposites. But this simply isn't true, for they come from the same ideological root and share manifest similarities. It's normally assumed, largely because of the apocalyptic savagery of the fighting that took place between them in World War II, that these ideologies must come from different ends of the political spectrum. That philosophical kin could not have fought with that kind of intensity and bloodletting. But this is simply false. In fact, leftist factions have always turned on other leftist factions. It's defined the movement since its origin. In revolutionary France, the radical Montagnards turned on all the other leftist factions. The Brissotins, Cordeliers, the Enrages, the Sans-Culottes, and on each other. The Bolsheviks in Russia turned mercilessly on Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, Trotskyites, Ukrainian communists, and themselves. In China, Cambodia, Vietnam, the communists continually decimated their own ranks. Wave after wave of purges tore through the communist parties, resulting in millions of people tortured and murdered. Virtually all the blood they shed, in China and Cambodia at least, was that of their own supporters. And Karl Marx too, the old sage himself, feuded with his own philosophical kin far more frequently, and with far greater vitriol, than he ever did with those supposed to be his rivals. Moses Hess, Bruno Bauer, Mikhail Bakunin, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Ludwig Feuerbach, Wilhelm Weitling, Max Stirner, Karl Grun, Gottfried Kinkel, Andreas Gottschalk, August Willich, Karl Vogt, Ferdinand Lassalle, and Karl Schapper. He poured bitter scorn and biting hatred on virtually every leftist of his day, in a concerted effort to destroy their reputations and careers. And if you think about it, there might be other reasons why the Nazis didn't hold much stock in the teachings of Karl Marx, who was Jewish, or why they might have disliked his disciples. Yagoda, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, Kaganovich, all Jewish. These internecine squabbles remain as rife on the left as ever, visible in the eternal civil wars in Britain's Labour Party and Antifa's loathing for the Democrats. And similarly, the friction between National Socialism and Bolshevism originated less from an ideological disparity than from their pursuit of the same slice of the electorate. Jonah Goldberg memorably argued that the battle between Nazis and communists was a case of two dogs fighting for the same bone. It's no coincidence, after all, that the swastika is displayed on a red flag. Hitler estimated that almost half the 2,000-strong audience at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich on 24th of February 1920, his first major speech, was comprised of communists. By the time he'd stepped down from the podium, they'd all been converted to the cause. A neat illustration of the crossover appeal between the movements. The Führer also confirmed to Rausching that communists were to be welcomed into the Nazi ranks. He was clear that the petty bourgeois social democrat and the trade union boss will never make a national socialist. But the communist always will. And if we examine the parallels between Nazism and Bolshevism, the ease of this cross-pollination becomes clear. Both base their policy line on attacking privileged elites while focusing on economically socialist principles. Both eulogise the proletariat while pouring scorn on the parasites of capitalism. And both produced rafts of strikingly similar propaganda, which depicted workers breaking free from their chains, or toiling contentedly in sunny meadows while, no doubt, singing hymns to the great leader responsible for such abundance. Just as in Russia, the majority of Germany's cultural talents chose exile over the artistic handcuffs imposed by their leaders, while the Nazi practice of book burning was emulated on a considerably widened scale in Maoist China. In both states, scapegoats had to be found, to lump all societal problems onto them, and to unite the masses in opposition to them. And in both cases, those scapegoats came from the privileged elites who were blamed for oppressing the masses. They were the capitalists, the kulaks, the Jew, the Zionist. The state that Hitler ended up forging was virtually indistinguishable from the Soviet and Maoist cases that preceded and followed it, or from any other hard-left state in history. Nazi Germany was a single-party state that dissolved trade unions, banned opposition parties, closed down any representative parliamentary bodies, and called a halt to elections. The judicial process was elbowed aside in favour of government diktats. The state took full control of the nation's press, education and media, produced blizzards of propaganda to shore up the regime, brought all professional and social clubs and activities under the aegis of the party, and the Nazis took a leading role in the economic development of the nation. All these states focused on indoctrinating and weaponizing youth. They prioritised social engineering and enforced a narrow coda of acceptable thought and behaviour. For any dissidents, there was a brutal network of prison camps and a secret police force to whip people into line. Any particularly troublesome elements were liquidated. And all these states severely repressed the church as well. Many people argue, and fully believe, that the Nazis were Christian, but this is patently untrue, and it should be obvious as to why. After all, Jesus, like Marx, was a Jew. The workers and rural labourers in Nazi Germany were eulogised, while scorn was poured on the parasites of capitalism. And the state's actions were euphemistically dressed up as cleansing, with their victims referred to as cattle or lice. Indeed, the Nazis considered themselves to be stout working-class folk, rebelling against an elite mired in greed and corruption, rather like every leftist organisation there's ever been. The Nazis had long vowed that they would overthrow the privileged elites and the state that had ruled the people, and they were as good as their word when they achieved power. The entire machinery of the state was directed towards advancing a narrow political ideology, while attacking a relatively small sector of the population, an assault largely justified on economic grounds. The state relied on complete subservience to and reverence for the party, and in particular, to the leader. The central tenets of conservatism are for a small government and the free market, with all the liberties that programme entails. The belief on the right is that the state should serve the individual. But Hitler preferred big government and a state-controlled economy, with all the restrictions inherent in that manifesto. In his collectivist interpretation, individuals existed to serve the needs of the state. The same outcome of every far-left regime there's ever been. The totalitarian states of Russia, China, and Germany are virtually indistinguishable in every way that counts. And all of these similarities were widely accepted at the time. Drew La Rochelle, the noted writer and intellectual, had switched his allegiance from communism to Nazism as he believed the latter was a better bet for imposing the international socialism he craved, while Max Eastman, W.H. Chamberlain, Peter Drucker and F.A. Voigt all concluded the essentially identical nature of fascism and communism in the 1930s. Friedrich Hayek had done the same in devastating fashion, and concluded that Few are ready to recognise that the rise of fascism and Nazism was not a reaction against the socialist trends of the preceding period, but a necessary outcome of those tendencies. C.P. Snow, the novelist and Soviet sympathiser, claimed of the Nazi-Soviet pact that two political sophisticates were always likely to get together. This pact was widely celebrated on the left. Many progressives excitedly defended it and adamantly believed that it would bleed capitalism white. The likes of the Dean of Canterbury and G.D.H. Cole, the Oxford professor, celebrated the Nazi-Soviet pact. Even when war between them became inevitable, Goebbels excitedly recorded his hopes for the invasion in his diary on 16th of June 1941. There would be no return to the Tsars after Bolshevism was overthrown. True socialism would take its place. Nazism and communism are effectively two sides of the same coin. Different approaches towards a virtually identical goal. They are far more similar than they are generally perceived to be. And they certainly both originated on the radical left. The idea that Hitler is of the far right, Stalin's polar opposite, is simply not true on any level. If you've enjoyed this film, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in these topics, I've written 2 books which go into them in extensive detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.